It feels like sovereignty is just permanent. Like once a nation wins its independence, that's it. The story's over, the flag is raised, and the rest is just footnotes. But here's the thing about the 1860s. There was a 6-year stretch when a European monarch sat on a throne in the middle of North America. Not in a history book about some ancient empire, not in a story about the old colonial world, in Mexico City, with a crown, a court, and an archduke from Austria who had never set foot in the country before he was told he would rule it. So let me take you back to the very beginning. In 1821, Mexico did what the United States had done almost 50 years earlier. It fought its way out from under an empire. 11 years of war, hundreds of thousands dead, and finally, independence from Spain. A new republic, young and unproven, standing where a Spanish viceroyalty used to be. But independence didn't mean peace. For the next 4 decades, Mexico tore itself apart from the inside. Conservatives who wanted a centralized government, tied to the church and the old aristocracy. Liberals who wanted federalism, secular law, and land reform. The fighting was constant enough that historians count dozens of pronunciamientos, military uprisings, in less than 40 years. By 1857, it boiled over into outright civil war, the Reform War. 3 brutal years, liberals against conservatives, each side claiming to be the legitimate government of Mexico. And in January of 1861, the liberals won. Benito Juárez, a Zapotec lawyer from Oaxaca who had risen to the presidency, marched into Mexico City as the head of a reunified, but devastated, republic. This should have been the beginning of stability, a country finally free to build itself. Instead, it was the beginning of something else entirely. In July of 1861, Juárez's Congress made a decision that was, on paper, purely financial. Mexico's treasury was empty. Decades of civil war had gutted it, so the government suspended interest payments, for 2 years, on every foreign debt it owed, to Britain, to Spain, and to France. It wasn't a default born of bad faith. The historical record on this is fairly consistent. Mexico had barely paid any interest at all since the 1850s, through government after government, revolution after revolution. This was simply the latest, most honest admission of a treasury that had nothing left to give. But 3 empires across the Atlantic didn't see it as an internal Mexican problem. They saw it as a debt collection problem, and one they intended to solve together. On October 31st, 1861, representatives of France, Spain, and Great Britain sat down in London and signed a treaty, the Convention of London. Its stated purpose was narrow and almost bureaucratic: coordinate a joint expedition to Mexico, seize customs revenue at Mexican ports, and secure repayment. Nothing about conquest, nothing about crowns. Here's what makes this moment sting a little more than it should. The United States, the one power with both a doctrine and a motive to object, could do nothing. The Monroe Doctrine, the standing American position that European powers should stay out of the Western Hemisphere, was, in that exact autumn of 1861, being tested by a country tearing itself apart. The American Civil War had begun 5 months earlier. Washington had no army to spare and no leverage to offer. The timing wasn't a coincidence anyone had to engineer. It was simply the gap the 3 powers walked through. By December of 1861 and into January of 1862, tripartite forces, French, Spanish, and British troops together, landed at Veracruz and occupied the port. And for a moment, it looked exactly like what the treaty said it would be. On February 19, 1862, Mexican and Allied representatives met at La Soledad and hammered out preliminary terms. Mexico's government, battered, broke, but still standing, offered to negotiate directly. Spain and Britain, for their part, seemed satisfied. They wanted their money. They didn't want a war. France wanted something else. This is where the story needs a second layer, not a simpler one. It would be easy to say the debt was the whole story, but that flattens what was actually happening in Paris. Napoleon III had ambitions in Mexico that went well beyond a ledger. He saw an opportunity to check the growing power of the United States while it was distracted by its own civil war, to plant a Catholic, Latin monarchy in the Americas as a counterweight to Protestant, Republican influence, and to restore a version of French imperial prestige that had been dormant since his uncle's fall. The unpaid debt gave him the pretext. It did not give him the motive. So while Spain and Britain treated La Soledad as a foundation to build on, French commissioners began making demands that had nothing to do with customs revenue, demands aimed, unmistakably, at Mexico's government itself. Spain and Britain saw where this was going, and on April 11, 1862, they did something almost as remarkable as the invasion itself. They walked away. Their troops withdrew from Veracruz, their governments recognizing that whatever France intended next, it was no longer a joint debt collection mission. France stayed, alone now, with an army on Mexican soil and an ambition no treaty had authorized. 2 weeks later, that army began its march toward Mexico City. The French army that marched inland from Veracruz in the spring of 1862 was not expecting a fight. 6,000 men, well-equipped, backed by artillery, moving through a country they assumed was ready to collapse, or worse, ready to welcome them. French officials had been told, by Mexican conservatives eager for a return to monarchy, that the population would rise up in support once French boots hit Mexican soil. Nobody rose up. On May 5, 1862, that army reached the city of Puebla, fortified, defended, and standing directly between the French and their objective, Mexico City. General Charles de Lorenzez led the assault against 2 hilltop forts, Loreto and Guadalupe, and against a Mexican force that was smaller, less experienced, and far less equipped. The French attack failed. 3 times they tried to take the forts. 3 times they were repelled. By the end of the day, Lorenzez had lost several hundred men and was forced to retreat toward Orizaba to wait for reinforcements. The Mexican commander who held that line was General Ignacio Zaragoza, a name that, if the story stopped here, might be the only one you'd remember from this entire war. This battle is why the 5th of May exists, as a date people still recognize, even outside Mexico, even if they've never heard the word Maximilian. Cinco de Mayo. It wasn't a battle that ended the war. It was a battle that delayed the fall of a country by an entire year, which, in a war like this one, turned out to matter enormously, because France did not walk away from Puebla. It regrouped. Napoleon III replaced Lorenzez with General Élie Fauré and poured in reinforcements. By some counts, close to 30,000 troops eventually committed to the campaign. In March of 1863, Fauré's army surrounded Puebla again. This time, there would be no repeat of the previous year. The siege ran for 2 months. Mexican defenders held out, street by street, fort by fort, until their supplies were gone. On May 17, 1863, Puebla fell. The road to the capital was now open, and nothing was left to stop the French army from walking down it. Juárez made the only decision that kept the Republic alive in anything but name. He didn't stand and fight for a city he could not hold. He left Mexico City with his cabinet, his archives, and what remained of his government, and he kept moving north, determined to keep the Mexican Republic breathing as a government in motion rather than let it die defending an address. In early June of 1863, French troops entered Mexico City. There was no siege of the capital, no last stand at the gates. The government that had suspended a debt payment 2 years earlier was now governing from a wagon, from a series of towns near the American border, while a foreign army occupied its capital. And almost immediately, the shape of what came next became clear. This was never going to end with France simply collecting on unpaid interest. Fauré convened a group of Mexican conservatives and monarchist sympathizers into a governing assembly, and that assembly did exactly what Napoleon III's supporters back in Paris had hoped it would do from the very beginning. It voted to offer Mexico's throne to a European prince. Here is the strange center of this entire story. Mexico's monarchy was never restored by Mexicans revolting against a republic. It was assembled, from the outside, by men who had already decided the outcome before they asked the question. In July of 1863, with Fourier's army occupying Mexico City and Juárez's government reduced to a caravan moving through the north, the French general convened an assembly of Mexican conservatives and notables. This assembly did what it had been arranged to do. It declared Mexico a monarchy again, and it voted to offer the crown to Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian of Austria, the younger brother of the Austrian emperor, a man who had never governed a country of his own, let alone one he had never visited. To make it look like more than a decision made in a French general's office, delegations were sent through Mexican towns collecting declarations of adhesion, statements of support for the empire, gathered under military occupation, in regions where refusing wasn't exactly a safe option. These were later presented to Maximilian as proof of a nation's enthusiastic will. Historians treat this so-called popular mandate with real skepticism today. A vote taken under occupying troops is not the same thing as a nation choosing its ruler, and the channel won't pretend otherwise. On April 10, 1864, at his family's castle of Miramar on the Adriatic coast, Maximilian formally accepted. A Mexican delegation knelt before him. Cannons fired salutes from the fortress walls. Both sides addressed the moment as if it were a homecoming rather than an installation. But before Maximilian would agree to go, he needed guarantees, and those guarantees came in the form of a private agreement with Napoleon III, known as the Treaty of Miramar. France would keep troops in Mexico to secure the new empire. France would lend the money to run it, and Mexico, a country that hadn't been able to pay its previous debts, would be obligated to repay every peso of it, plus the cost of the French military campaign that had put Maximilian on the throne in the first place. Read that again. The intervention that began because Mexico couldn't service its debts ended with Mexico legally committed to a new debt, one specifically created to fund the invasion and the government installed by it. Maximilian and his wife, Charlotte of Belgium, known in Mexico as Carlota, sailed for the Americas that same month. They arrived to a country most of which they had never seen, to govern people whose language, politics, and history neither of them fully understood, and whose republic had never asked for them. And almost immediately, the arrangement began to unravel in ways nobody in Paris or Miramar had planned for. Maximilian, an idealist more liberal than the conservatives who'd summoned him, kept several of Juárez's own reforms in place. He refused to overturn land redistribution. He extended protections to indigenous communities. The very Mexican conservatives who had begged Europe for a Catholic monarch now found themselves ruled by an emperor more progressive than they wanted, while Mexican liberals saw him, correctly, as a foreign puppet propped up by French bayonets, whatever reforms he kept. He had, in other words, alienated almost everyone who might have kept him in power, and the one thing actually holding his throne in place, the French army, was never going to stay forever. The French army that held Mexico's throne in place was never going to stay forever, but what actually pushed it out is worth slowing down for, because it's easy to skip past as a footnote. Throughout the American Civil War, Secretary of State William Seward had walked a careful line. He never recognized Maximilian's government. He never stopped supporting Juárez, but he also avoided outright confrontation with France, because Abraham Lincoln's government had a far bigger problem at home and no appetite for a second war against a European power while fighting one against the Confederacy. Then, in April of 1865, the Confederacy surrendered, and almost overnight, the calculation changed. The United States now had an enormous, battle-hardened army with nowhere left to fight, and a southern border where a French-backed monarchy sat only a few hundred miles from Texas. General Philip Sheridan was sent to the Rio Grande with tens of thousands of troops, officially to enforce neutrality along the border. Unofficially, the message was unmistakable. Confederate officers fleeing defeat were slipping into Mexico to join Maximilian's forces, and Washington watched a French client stayed on its doorstep with open hostility. Mexico's own minister to the United States, Matias Romero, spent years quietly building American political support for Juárez's cause, one relationship at a time, inside a government that couldn't officially commit to anything until the war at home was won. France felt the pressure directly. On February 12, 1866, Seward formally communicated to Napoleon III's government the position of the United States on the ongoing occupation. By April, the French foreign minister confirmed what Washington wanted to hear. French troops would leave Mexico, withdrawn in 3 stages, between November of 1866 and November of 1867. Napoleon III had his own reasons to comply beyond the American pressure. A costly, unpopular war, a treasury strained by an adventure that had never paid for itself, and a rising threat from Prussia far closer to home. But the timing tells its own story. The moment America stopped being paralyzed by its own war, France's appetite for this one evaporated. By early 1867, the French army was gone, and so, within months, was the empire it had propped up. Here's the part of this story that deserves its own moment, because it's easy to watch this and think, well, that settled it. Europe learned its lesson. It didn't. 35 years later, in December of 1902, British, German, and Italian warships imposed a naval blockade on Venezuela. The trigger was almost identical. President Cipriano Castro had refused to pay debts owed to European bondholders. The 3 powers seized Venezuelan gunboats, and in January of 1903, German ships bombarded the fort at Puerto Cabello. Castro held out, eventually agreeing to submit the claims to international arbitration, and the blockade was lifted that February. This time there was no invasion, no installed monarch. The model of intervention had evolved, but the underlying leverage hadn't changed. An unpaid debt, owed to European creditors, once again became the opening for foreign warships to appear off a Latin American coast. And this time, an American president, Theodore Roosevelt, used the episode to justify a new doctrine of his own. The idea, announced in his message to Congress in December of 1904, that the United States itself would act first in cases of chronic wrongdoing in the hemisphere, specifically to keep European powers from having the pretext to intervene again. So if you've ever sensed that Latin American sovereignty, throughout this whole period, always felt a little conditional, dependent on who was watching, who owed whom, and who was strong enough at that particular moment to enforce a boundary, this is why. Mexico in the 1860s and Venezuela in 1902 are not 2 unrelated stories. They're the same mechanism, debt as leverage for foreign intervention, appearing twice in 50 years, on 2 different coastlines, with 2 different outcomes, only because, the second time, one hemisphere-spanning power had already decided this was its front yard to guard. By March of 1867, the last French troops had left Mexican soil, exactly as Napoleon III had promised Washington they would. What they left behind was an emperor who had been warned, more than once, that this moment was coming, and who chose to stay anyway. Maximilian could have left with the French army. Napoleon III, by this point, had all but abandoned the project. His own government offered Maximilian the option of returning to Europe. He refused. Whatever his motives, a sense of obligation to the conservative Mexicans who had crowned him, a genuine attachment to the country he'd tried, however imperfectly, to govern, or simply a stubborn unwillingness to accept the collapse of the entire venture, Maximilian withdrew instead to the city of Querétaro, gathering what remained of his loyal forces, including his 2 most committed generals, Miguel Miramón and Tomás Mejía. Republican forces under General Mariano Escobedo arrived outside Querétaro on March 5th and began a siege that would last more than 2 months. 42,000 Republican troops surrounded roughly 10,000 Imperial defenders. Weeks passed. Supplies dwindled. Imperial forces tried and failed to break out. And then, on the night of May 14th into the 15th, one of Maximilian's own officers, Colonel Miguel López, opened the gates of the city to the Republican army. The exact motives behind that decision remain debated by historians to this day. Some point to a promise of leniency for the emperor, others to simple self-preservation, and the channel won't pretend to settle that argument here. What's certain is the result. Querétaro fell from the inside, not from the walls. Maximilian was captured on the 15th of May, alongside Miramon and Mejia. A military tribunal in Querétaro sentenced all three to death. Diplomatic pleas arrived from across Europe, from monarchs, from Victor Hugo, from voices asking Juárez for clemency toward a man who, whatever his role, had personally opposed nothing of Mexico's liberal reforms. Juárez refused every one of them. Mexico, in his view, could not both punish every ordinary soldier who had fought for the empire and pardon the man who had worn its crown. On the morning of June 19, 1867, at a hill on the outskirts of Querétaro called Cerro de las Campanas, the Hill of the Bells, Maximilian, Miramon, and Mejia were executed by firing squad. Accounts describe Maximilian addressing the soldiers before the volley, reportedly framing his death as a gift to the country that had crowned him. The exact wording varies by source, so the channel treats it as reported rather than verified. Within weeks, Benito Juárez returned to the capital he had been forced to abandon 4 years earlier, not as a monarch restored, but as the president of a republic that had never, on paper, stopped existing. There was no ticker-tape parade for the United States in this story, and the channel won't invent one. Washington never fired a shot in Mexico. It didn't need to. A recovered, reunified American army sitting quietly on the Rio Grande, a State Department that simply refused to look away, and a diplomatic message delivered without theater. That was enough to tip the balance against an empire an ocean away from home. No triumphant announcement, no parade, just a boundary, held. Step back from Querétaro, from Puebla, from the crown offered at Miramar, and look at the shape of the whole thing. This wasn't a war between nations in the way we usually picture one. It was a debt, real and unpaid, that became the crack one empire needed to try something far larger than debt collection, and a young republic that survived only because a set of circumstances, some earned and some simply lucky, lined up in its favor. A civil war that ended just in time. A diplomat who never stopped pressuring quietly. A president who refused every plea for mercy because he understood that mercy for an emperor would have been an insult to every ordinary Mexican who died defending the republic against him. If any of this feels familiar, it should. Debt as a lever for foreign control, a local elite willing to trade sovereignty for stability, a monarch installed from outside and dressed up as the nation's own choice. We've told a version of this story before on this channel, half a world away, in a country carved out of the desert for entirely different resources, but through a strikingly similar mechanism. Empires rarely invent new tools. They just point the same ones at whatever border happens to be open. Mexico's story ended differently, not because France was less ambitious than other empires that have tried this, but because, for once, the timing broke the other way. A neighbor recovered fast enough and cared enough to close the door before it could be propped open for good. If this kind of hidden history, the moments that get compressed into a single Wikipedia line, when they deserve an hour, is what you come here for, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And if you've got a theory about why Miguel Lopez really opened those gates, or you think the United States gets too much credit, or too little, for how this ended, put it in the comments. I read all of them, and the best ones usually turn into the next video. If you haven't seen it yet, go watch how Britain built its own version of this story in the Middle East. Britain created Iraq to control its oil, then installed its own monarch. Same mechanism, same century of consequences, different desert, different crown.